Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here to talk to you about the best performances of Mahler's Third Symphony. Oh boy, this is going to be epic. Why? Because the third is Mahler's longest. In fact, it is the longest symphony ever written to be part of the standard repertoire. There are longer ones. I don't want to hear about them because we don't care about them. Mahler's third gets played all the time. It's really kind of fascinating how frequently it gets played. It is a full evening by itself. It's an hour and 40 minutes in most performances, unless you're Lauren Mazel with the Vienna Philharmonic, in which case it could take about 2 weeks. It requires a women's choir, a boys' choir or children's choir, an alto soloist, and just acres and acres of instruments. It's got 8 horns. It's got tons of brass. In fact, the hallmark of a great performance, something which you can sort of resolve on recordings, at least if it's not a live recording, is how the brass do, because the piece is murder, just murder for the orchestral brass section. The first movement is a 35-minute long opposition between 2 marches, one of which is marked by a trombone solo, and the other of which requires all the woodwinds and brass to be going crazy. And then you have crazy, the offstage post horn or trumpet solo in the scherzo, and you've got horn duets in the fourth movement, pianissimo, after they've just been blowing their lips off for an hour and a bit. Then they have to play softly and constantly. And then finally, in the finale, which is a 25-minute long adagio, it ends with a glorious brass chorale for the full brass section playing triple piano after they've been playing this entire piece for about an hour and 35 minutes. And they all have to sustain this. And then it has a huge apotheosis at the end. Oh, it's just such a ridiculous challenge for an orchestral brass section. And today's orchestral brass sections can do it because the players are so fine and so superbly well trained. Even so, I've heard performances, quite a few of them, where things go very, very badly wrong in the brass section. It can still happen. But basically, today orchestras can do it, which is why they play the symphony, because ignoring, the logistical and technical difficulties in bringing it to performance, it's so much fun. Oh my God, it's fun. It's also thematically related both to the Second Symphony and the Fourth Symphony. So it's part of the group of symphonies they call Mahler's Wunderhorn symphonies, because they set texts from that collection of poetry, The Youth's Magic Horn, Das Knaben Wunderhorn, which he also made a lot of orchestral songs from. There's about a dozen of those. And, for that reason, all of these pieces sort of fit together, and they are wonderful. He also quotes a bit of the march from the first movement in the Rondo Burlesque of the Ninth Symphony. So Mahler's wonderful that way. He basically wrote one huge piece of music, everything relates to everything else, and then cut it off into chunks and labeled them Symphony number 1, Symphony number 6, or whatever. But I have to say, the other fascinating thing about Mahler is that one symphony sounds so different from the others. Nothing at the same time that there are thematic relationships. You could also say with equal justification that he never repeated himself, and that each symphony represents an entirely new world and conception. And this symphony is really a case in point, because, I first heard Mahler based on the Second Symphony, the Resurrection. And then I thought, this is wonderful. Let's listen to the third. And I put it on, and it was like, what the hell is that? It sounded so different, so completely different. And its intent is completely different. All of the initial 3, numbered symphonies, 2, 3, and 4. Number 1 is a separate case. It came earlier. But 2, 3, and 4 all deal with aspects of spiritual belief in the afterlife or spiritual values or some sort of thing like that, the affirmation of spiritual existence. And they all do it completely differently. Now, the second is, of course, a much more obviously religious conception. It deals with the resurrection, perpetual life through resurrection of the dead, not in a doctrinaire sense, not according to Judaism or Christianity or any particular religion, but just the concept, the resurrection, the idea that we will all live again and we'll join God in perpetual life. Now, that was Mahler's idea. The third symphony is Darwinian, sort of, in a way, because the program that Mahler gave to the work charts a series of evolutionary stages. It begins with summer marching in, was what he called it. Pan awakes, summer marches in. It is the rebirth of nature itself, an inanimate nature versus what you might call animate, life-giving nature. And that's what it is. You have one march, which is a funeral march. It's a very dark, heavy, creepy, wonderfully creepy, incredibly creepy march, followed by a very life-affirming, very, very Sousa-like. I mean, with piccolos screaming at the top in the descant, and it's Stars and Stripes Forever. It's a real serious military march that signifies the triumphant progress of summer. And it takes a long time before that triumphant progress of summer actually happens. It really does. It's a 35-minute long single movement in modified sonata form. And it is extremely, extremely leisurely in its progress, but also volcanic in its climaxes and in the variety and riotous range of stuff that's in it. And it's the hardest of all of Mahler's movements, single movements, arguably to pull off in performance. That's why there's so many bad performances of it. But that's the first movement. And once life has been established, it is ready to evolve. And so the first movement is a flower piece. It deals with nature in a very stylized, elegant, and sensual way. Then you get critters in the third movement. You get animals, and the animals listen to an offstage post horn. That is the human element, the first suggestion of a human element. And of course, that post horn is playing a fabulous tune. It's playing the Jota Aragonesa, as in the Glinka Spanish Rhapsody or the Glinka Spanish Overture No. 1 or Liszt Spanish Rhapsody. You know the tune. Da 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 ba da 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 da. That's the Jota Aragonesa. And Mahler uses it in his third symphony, and it is so incongruous because it's played off stage by a trumpet in the most dreamy possible way. And it's the first intimation of human life. And then the fourth movement is Nietzsche's Midnight Song from Also sprach Zarathustra. It talks about the fact that in the midst of joy, we long for eternity, that the world is deep and full of sorrow and life is basically miserable. And it's only 8 minutes long, and it's sung by an alto, and it's another very, very moody and spooky piece. Then the fifth movement is one of the most remarkable that Mahler ever wrote. It contains no violins at all. It's for the two choruses and the alto solo, lower strings, woodwinds, and some horns, and lots of bells, glockenspiels and chimes and things, and they're all going bim bam whoopity doo, and they sing a song about Jesus and the apostles and love God and all that stuff. But it's an example of religious kitsch. It's an example, in a way, in its charming and delicious way, of the pointlessness, in a way, of traditional religion. And I think it's just a marvelous way of doing it because Mahler does it with such charm and such kindness. I mean, he's being very nice about telling people that the doctrinaire version of religion is not where he's going at all. And then the last movement was called What Love Tells Me in his original program. The idea that beyond religion and all of that stuff, there is a simple, beautiful spiritual unity in which we all participate, which is inspired by the spirit of love. And that's how the symphony ends, with a 25-minute long, 21-minute, depending on how you do it, adagio, slow movement, that ends with a wonderful, wonderful, glowing brass apotheosis. And all of these movements are related to each other. And Mahler was very smart. He waited until after he'd written the last 5 movements before writing the first movement. And so he stuck into the first movement foreshadowings of all of the movements to come. And that makes the whole piece very well unified. In fact, the end of the first movement, the third movement, and the last movement are all the same. You may notice that they're just at different tempos. The idea, they're all unified by the same timpani motive, pounding, boom, 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 boom. That's how each of those movements ends, although in different speeds and with different music on top of it. And so the whole symphony has that sort of unity. And as it proceeds from stage to stage, you hear how similar motives are reworked to create what Mahler regarded as his sort of higher progressive spiritual progress. It's an amazing, amazing symphony. It really is. And it's no wonder that it's become really rather popular and has been recorded so many times, given its length and complexity. Now, there are a couple of textual issues that we'll get to in talking about individual performances. It's very, very interesting. But one of the things I do want to mention, just for fun, is part of, Dave's handy guide to Mahler's weird use of percussion instruments, because the Third Symphony is one of the 4 Mahler symphonies, the others being the Second, the Sixth, and the Seventh, that have a part for a ruta. A ruta, or root as we call it in English, is just a bundle of twigs that you hit the bass drum case with. And I happen to have one. Here it is. This is a root. This is your root. Now, there are no 2 roots which are the same because there is no standard design for a root. You have to build your own. And I found this one. This was actually was bound at this end with something very firm, and you use this sort of stick thing as a type of drumstick. But I looked at it and said, this is my root. And so I ripped it apart and soaked it in water and to make these things a little bendy, and it's a root. In the Third Symphony, he asks for root trills, and only in the second movement. So it sounds sort of like that. It makes the sound almost of fluttering wings. It's quite wonderful. I'm going to play you that little passage because I have permission now to use a couple more labels. We're getting there, folks. Here, this is Ivan Fischer on Channel Classics. Here is where the root comes in. So there you go. What a remarkable sound, isn't it? Mahler uses this in the Second Symphony in the Scherzo, where it's going boom, 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 and then, like that. And in various other places as well. Now, where did he find this thing? I mean, where did this come up with? Most times, I've seen actual branches used for this in the Third Symphony. Actually, in one performance in Carnegie Hall, I saw it. They just took a couple. Technically, it's supposed to be birch. You get your birch tree and you whack a couple branches off, and they whacked it up against the back wall of Carnegie Hall to do the trills that Mahler requires. Where the root originated, it was actually in Turkish percussion. For example, in Haydn's Military Symphony, if you listen to it where it's going dum ba da 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 dum, and the bass drum part is written tails up and tails down. It's boom chick 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 boom chick 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 like that, and the chick chick chicks are done by a root that you whack on the bass drum case. It was part of the normal way of playing Turkish percussion, which is cymbals, bass drum, and triangle, or Turkish crescent, or some other jingly thing, and that's where it originally existed. Mahler never uses it in its original form, although he does a little bit in the finale of the Seventh Symphony. He just liked that dry, brittle sound of that sort of, and so he writes for it. Strauss also uses it in Electra and a couple other places. It was one of those fin de siècle sort of extravagances. But that is a root, so you should know about it. Now you know what it sounds like, and you can listen for it for the 10 seconds Mahler requires it when you listen to the other 1 hour 39 minutes and 50 seconds of the symphony. So now we need to talk about recordings, and I have to tell you, and once again, I have limited myself to a dozen in this case, because, really, isn't it just enough? Lordy, lordy. How many of these things are you gonna listen to? It's really amazing. And there are many good performances, but these, I think, really are the cream of the crop, or the most interesting for various reasons. And I'm going to begin with something of a sleeper. Here it is. It's Heinz Rügner with the Berlin is it the Staatskapelle Berlin? I think it is. I'm trying to see here. It's like tiny, the Radio Symphony Orchestra Berlin Radio Symphony on Berlin Classics. This is not a typically great performance, but I like it because it just has personality. There's sometimes it's fun to hear people who are not used to a certain idiom try and attempt a work and succeed. That's the key. The key is not that it just sounds bizarre because they have no idea what they're doing and it's like grotesque in a party record. My point is that the sounds that they make are not exactly what you might expect in Mahler Symphony. They're a very East German standard sort of orchestra. And Mahler was writing in this symphony, above all, in the first movement, almost against that kind of orchestra. But they do it. They do it, and they do it with gusto and enthusiasm. And I enjoy the performance for that reason. Because I like to hear people working and succeeding. These days, everything sounds so easy, orchestras are so good, and conductors are all supposed to know Mahler, and they can get away with giving you a technically correct, incredibly boring performance of Mahler's Third Symphony any day of the week. But this is technically correct and not boring. And it sounds different from all the other Mahler thirds that you'll hear out there. And for that reason, I find it interesting to take out once in a while and listen to. Rügner was a good conductor, and this is one of his finer efforts. Next is Raphael Kubelik with the Bavarians. This is in his Mahler cycle. I like Kubelik because even though he tends to underplay all of these symphonies, actually, in this first Mahler cycle, not necessarily in all of his live performances. But, these are very, very well-disciplined, neat performances. But he's a Czech conductor, and he lets the woodwinds do their thing. And in these early Mahler symphonies, that is so important. It's so important. The marches here, they sound marvelous. They really do. And later on, he keeps the symphony moving. It's flowing. It's nicely done. It has that Wunderhorn character. It's something he also captures in the Fourth Symphony. Doesn't work so well in the second, but in the third and fourth, where you have so much of that folk-like element in Mahler, where the woodwinds lead and the tunes have simple repetitions, and they need to be characterized. They need to sound fruity and full of vivacity. Kubelik is really, really very good. And so I enjoy that Mahler third. You also hear that, by the way, in Maurice Abravanel's recording, which is on Vanguard. The inner movements are splendid. They really are. Somebody in the comments section mentioned that, and when I did my Abravanel talk, that his Mahler third has wonderful inner movements, and it does. It also has a pretty good first movement, all things considered, although the trumpets crack at the end, and there's not a great orchestra. But it has that same sort of unaffected naturalness and flow that really helps a lot in a big, long symphony where you're going to be sitting there for a long time. Next, Neumann and the Czech Philharmonic, because if you want woodwinds and you want the sound of Czech music, and Mahler is never at his, he's Czech. He was born in Bohemia, even though he was German-speaking Czech, and this performance is one of the high points of Neumann's Mahler cycle. It's quite wonderful. You just hear the Czech Philharmonic doing its thing at its best, and Neumann keeps it moving very, very nicely. Now, this performance has one very odd textural issue. You know, in the central development section in the first movement, when all the brass bands go mad, and there's that what Mahler called the Western Wind section, you know, and the mob, you know, it's deliberately vulgar music, and the orchestra starts hurling march tunes at each other, including one that goes bidam bum 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 badum badum bum badum 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 badum. There is a very odd either transposing error or textural difference in this performance, which I'm going to play for you. Listen right now. See what I mean? I mean, you know, they're playing in parallel fifths, which is really, really weird sounding. It kind of works. And I can't say that it's a mistake because, first of all, I can't believe that they wouldn't have corrected it, although you never know. And second of all, a lot of the Mahler performances in this cycle have small textural differences from normative Mahler performances, which seem to indicate to me that it may be that they were playing from proprietary parts that were copied differently from anybody else's. There are some odd things in the Fifth Symphony too, and a couple other places. So it's a possibility. Anyway, it's a wonderful, wonderful Mahler third. And the alto soloist, by the way, is Christa Ludwig, which is nice to have. And it's really a beautiful, beautiful performance. Next, Michael Gielen. Now, Michael Gielen is you know, I mean, he is, you know, the king of expressionistic nightmares. And the first movement of this symphony offers many opportunities for expressionistic craziness, which Gielen seizes with great enthusiasm. He relishes things that are strange and ugly and gnarly, and he wrings all of that out of it. But it's, in all other respects, too, a very, very fine performance, performed with all of the enthusiasm and gusto, and because the symphony has such a philosophical sort of underpinning to it, you know that Gielen is going to dig his talons into it because he likes meaning, deep philosophical meaning. Whether or not the music really has it or doesn't have it is not really the issue, and he's all ready to go because it excites him, and the performance is consequently an extremely exciting one. Also, absolutely first class, and this is one that may not have occurred to you, but I have to tell you, it's a great one. Ozawa and the Boston Symphony. Now, I saw them do this live. They do a fantastic Mahler 3. It is, first of all, it's wonderful to hear the Boston Symphony play this because we don't have a lot of Mahler from the Boston Symphony other than this cycle. And it is an absolutely extraordinarily finely played performance, but beautifully paced. I mean, Ozawa just has the shape of the work in his head and projects it beautifully. Tempos tend to be a bit on the swift side. The textures are wonderfully clear and clean. The first movement has tons of swagger, and best of all, the brass playing in the final chorale is just smoking. It's just wonderful. I love it. So I know that it's stuck in a big box now. It may be impossible to find separately anymore, but if you see it, if you get a chance to listen to it, I'm going to put it down here, give it some serious thought. It's an extraordinarily fine and underrated performance, and it deserves your attention. Another wonderful performance, a newcomer that's superb, is Manfred Honeck with the Pittsburgh Symphony. Oh, what a great orchestra they are, with the best horn section in the history of the universe. I kid you not. They play like, oh, it's glorious. But, you know, not only is the brass playing unbelievable, but Honeck is such a wonderfully natural conductor in almost the old German style. That is, he plays all the music with this sort of unaffected rubato, especially in the finale. that has an incredible range of tempo in this performance, but you never notice, that it's speeding up or slowing down. All of a sudden, it's just moving faster or moving slower. It all feels so completely organic. And that's, it's an organic symphony. It talks about organic evolution. It's Darwinian. It does evolution. You want it to sound organic. And this performance really does sound organic. Michelle de Jong, the alto soloist, she's starting to wobble a bit. She's not the best in the world, but she's not terrible. And the sound is just a little bit lacking in glitter on top. It's on Exton, the Japanese label. It's a live performance, but wow. Astonishing playing and wonderfully spontaneous conducting. Haitink is the real deal, folks. He really is. And this is an excellent, excellent new Mahler third. It was a pleasure to listen to. Now, let's see who else we got. Oh, we got a few more left. This is so much fun. I just love doing this. Andrew Litton in the Dallas Symphony on Delos. Litton's second and third, let me be dogmatic, are as great as any performances out there. He just nailed Mahler 2 and Mahler 3. He's another one of those conductors who's not embarrassed by the music. He understands that when Mahler pulls out all the stops and wants you to sound vulgar and crazy, you need to sound vulgar and crazy. And he lets the orchestra do it. The sonics are terrific too. It's a little bit low level. It really is. But if you crank it up, it's as fine a performance as you'll ever hear. There isn't a single moment that goes wrong in this performance. He just nails all of those special Mahlerian moments where you have to be just so aware of what the orchestra is doing and what Mahler wants it to do. And he hits them, but he also understands very, very well how to sustain a tempo through the long adagio, how to keep things flowing and moving. It's just the opposite of Benjamin Zander. Zander knows all those weird sounds Mahler wants to make, and he invariably makes them, but then he doesn't know what to do with the rest of the music. Litton does, and it's quite wonderful. It really is. Also, equally wonderful, Ricardo Chailly with the Concertgebouw. The Concertgebouw is the Mahler 3 orchestra par excellence in some respects, because they have one of the great woodwind sections along with the Czech Philharmonic, and it shows. They strut their stuff in this performance, which is luminously recorded. It's absolutely beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. It's one of the high points of Chailly's Mahler cycle, and if you have the cycle, then you already know that, and it's just terrific from beginning to end. I really also believe that Mahler's third is one of those symphonies where you have to trust the orchestra. It really helps to have an orchestra that knows Mahler and knows the idiom. And if you trust them to do their thing, you're going to get great, great results under those circumstances. It really benefits from that. It's not like the Rögner, where you have a bunch of people trying to figure it out as they go. And they do, they get there. But here you've got people who are completely comfortable with the idiom and just revel in the sounds that Mahler makes. People who understand the idiom can also be incredibly lazy and slovenly when they do it. They could be, as Mahler said, tradition is Schlamperei, tradition is slovenliness. But no, not in this performance, not at all. And it is further proof of the Concertgebouw's bona fides as Mahler 3 guys is Haitink's first one in Amsterdam. He didn't do another one, but there's the Cursed Matinee performance, which is not as good actually as the studio performance, I have to tell you. This is one of the great, great Mahler 3s. You've got Maureen Forrester as the alto soloist, and this is the old Concertgebouw sound. They don't sound like the same orchestra under Chailly. Things changed there, especially the trombones. They had this tightly focused but somehow still dark and very vocal trombone sound. And boy, this is the trombone symphony, especially the first movement. And also, they have their old style percussion, that weird tam-tam that goes whoosh, it's all here and it's wonderful. But what this performance has, there are two things that make this performance particularly interesting. The last chord of the finale, Mahler marks that the orchestra has to play with a noble, saturated tone without any kind of harshness. It has the most beautiful final chord I've ever heard in my life. It is an organ tone. It is the most gorgeous thing you've ever heard. It's wonderful. The other thing that's interesting is that in that same crazy passage that the Czech Philharmonic did differently, they do differently. They must also have a different version. You know the part where the trumpets are going ba-da-da, 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 brum, brum, brum. Well, they don't do it that way. They go bia-da-dum, 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 bia-da-dum. I don't know why. I don't know what they were reading from, but their version of it is slightly different as well. It's one of those textural things, and this is before I think some of these critical editions were issued, and so maybe there were different kind of parts, orchestral parts that they played from that were in circulation. Particularly since the Concertgebouw did Mahler cycles. They did Mahler cycles, or almost Mahler cycles, under Mahler. Mengelberg did them right after Mahler died, and so they had their own tradition of performing this music. And I think some of that survives in this performance, which makes it extremely, extremely wonderful. But I have left here 3 performances which I think represent the absolute creme de la creme of Mahler 3s. And if you want a creme, then you really need to hear Ivan Fischer with the Budapest Festival Orchestra on Channel Classics. Fischer's Mahler has had its ups and downs. They all do, because it's usually a mistake to do cycles. It's really better to just find the ones you do the best and just do them and die happy. But Fischer's doing them all. The second and third in this cycle have been stunning. Absolutely stunning. The fourth is great too. But this third is amazing. It is absolutely amazing. It has a finale which is just about as beautiful as Haitink's. And I already played you a little sample of the second movement, and I'm going to play you the end of the first movement because it is absolutely stunning. I mean, the guy just gets it all right, and they sound like they're having a blast. And it just goes to show you, because this is an orchestra that's more famous for its elegance than its raw power. But when they're galvanized to do it, they do it. So here's the end of the first movement. Just great, isn't it? It's a wonderful, wonderful performance and great sound. And if you're looking for a new Mahler 3, a digital, an SACD, whatever, it's an SACD, it's surround sound, you want all that, this is the one to get, without a doubt. It is a great, great performance. Now, before we do our final, I want to talk to you about a performance which is not in my top 12, and it may surprise you. That's Jascha Hornstein. I have to confess, Hornstein is a second-rate conductor who made a lot of second-rate recordings. A friend of mine, a critic, said to me that Jascha Hornstein's great claim to fame is that every orchestra that he ever conducted made their worst recording under him, which I thought was actually kind of true. He was famous for, bringing Mahler to Britain. And yes, I've always said, who cares? I mean, really, who cares about Mahler in Britain? I mean, only maybe someone in Britain, and I'm not in Britain, so I don't care. That's not important. It's not important historically. It's not important for any other reason than if you think it's important to bring Mahler to Britain. Anyway, his Mahler third is not terrible. He did, the sixth, that live sixth is just horrifying. His famous live eighth is just miserable, bad playing, and terrible. It's yuck. He did some good stuff. His best Mahler performance probably is the first. Fourth, it's got Margaret Price. It's not bad. But he had a chronic difficulty that destroys his Mahler. And I imprinted on his third. I did when it was on Nonsuch because it was cheap and you could get it. And there weren't so many around. So, it was sort of like the standard one. You got it because it was there. And that's how I learned the symphony. But then I heard other people do it. And your options weren't great in those days. I mean, there was the Bernstein, which, that's the one. But we'll talk about it in a minute. And there was the Schulte LSO, which was horrible on Decca and obviously horrible. And Hornstein was better than that. But he had this inability or unwillingness to change tempo. I mean, this rigidity, and it's horrible. He conducts the entire first movement in a single tempo. And the first movement has huge, huge changes of texture and speed. I mean, literally speed. When that crazy central section erupts, it has to speed up. I mean, it just has to. Mahler says to. He can't do it. He can't do it or he won't do it. I don't know. But when Mahler says vorwärts, forward, he just sits there. It's just terrible. And in addition, there are some awful oddities of engineering. I mean, the timpani are way too prominent. They're way too far forward. And not only are they way too far forward, but they disappear at the end of the first movement. The final pitch when the march is going forward, bum ba da, and the timpani go bum 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 da 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 dum bum bum da dum bum boom. They're gone. They're not there, and it's just things like that, and they all add up. They increasingly add up to an extremely unsatisfying performance. As time has gone on, these performances, which got a lot of attention in their day because we had to make do with what there was, have not held up. They haven't held up at all. They don't sound that good. They're not played that well. And most importantly, the interpretation that Hornstein brings to the third is one of chronic stiffness and stodginess. And I think it's just unacceptable. I know there are people who swear by it, who were, imprinted on it and are loyal to it. And if they still love it, I always say that, love what you love. It's about what you like. It's not about what I like. But as an exemplar of Mahler's Third Symphony, and in the company of these performances, seriously, in the company of these, how could you prefer that? That is why I do not want to hear in the comments section, not that I could stop it, but I'm just telling you right now, unless you've listened to all of these, and you can tell me with total and complete honesty, not that you like Hornstein better, but that Hornstein is better for a reason, an actual musical reason. I don't want to hear it. I just don't want to hear it. That's crazy. It's just crazy. There are so many wonderful cases of people doing what Mahler asked them to do and achieving fabulous results. Why should we pay attention to somebody who doesn't? And beyond that, the one thing I've heard about his performances, and Mahler's third in particular, is that it has structural integrity. As if, the inability to change tempo is better structurally. It's not. That's absolutely untrue. I mean, a structure is not dependent on metronomic steadiness. A structure is dependent upon each section going at the pace and with the tempo that the composer intends. And sometimes that means changing the tempo. Sometimes it means relaxing the tempo or speeding up. That doesn't damage the structure. You can perform a piece of music in a way which is terribly sectionalized and italicized, but that has nothing to do with obeying the instructions that Mahler indicates so that the pieces have structural integrity, the structural integrity that Mahler intended. I mean, it's just such a BS line, and I've heard it for years, and so now I'm venting and getting rid of it and tell you now about the greatest version. You may love Hornstein. However, if you want to hear Mahler 3, it's got to be Bernstein. Just has to be. I mean, it just has to be. Bernstein's first one particularly. Now, the second one, very, very beautiful, very well done. Particularly, it has a better last movement than his first one, and it's better recorded in the last movement, particularly. However, Bernstein's first with the New York Phil is early. This is the piece that revealed Mahler's Third Symphony, and it still does. Probably better than just about any other version. There are so many moments in this performance, when you consider an hour and 40-minute long piece, where he just gets it all right. It sounds like it can't go any other way, especially in that first movement. You know, all of those craziness, the vulgar eruptions, the marches, the gnarly sounds, he just revels in it. The orchestra revels in it. It sounds like music from another world. It's a complete realization of this extraordinarily bizarre inspiration that Mahler had for this music. And as it goes on, it just gets better. It just gets better. You know, the second movement is charm incarnate. The third movement is quick. It's not slow, and that the trumpet, the post horn, is not so far away that it's making you crazy and you go to sleep trying to listen to it. It doesn't ever die. He keeps it moving, and it's exciting as hell in the coda. The fourth movement is beautiful. I think the soloist is Martha Lipton. Yeah, for this one, yes, Martha Lipton sings it beautifully. The fifth movement, the bim bam bell chorus thing, has never been done better. Period. Because the engineers highlight the bell sounds, the bells, the glockenspiel, and the low percussion in the central interlude. There has never been a performance as colorful and as visceral as that. And the final adagio is not too slow. It's beautifully paced. It is not the best recorded at the end. It doesn't have that glowing warmth that Fischer and Haitink bring to the final pages. It doesn't, because for sonic reasons, and maybe the Philharmonic didn't have that sound in its bones. But in all other respects, Bernstein's first, Mahler third, is still the Mahler third that reveals more of what this symphony can be and is than any other. And that is my final word. So thank you so much for listening to this very long talk about a very, very long symphony. Take care and keep on listening.